In our episode revision 14, we will revise government budget. Here we need to keep in mind three things. The first is the objectives of the government budget. The second, components of the government budget. And third, measures of government deficit. So we'll begin with objectives of the government budget. What type of questions are asked under this? We know there are four objectives, the first of which is allocation of resources, reallocation of resources. This means fulfillment of socio-economic objectives in an economy. Okay, so what type of objectives will be included under reallocation of resources? Here, reallocation of resources, reduction in income inequalities, which are the objectives of the government budget. Sometimes it's asked as a short note, or sometimes it is asked as the components individually. That means what all will be included under reallocation of resources. Okay, or categorize this under which objective or what value of the government budget. Questions like that are asked. So heavy taxes on harmful products like alcohol or cigarettes, which are not beneficial for the society, they will be included in the reallocation of resources. Then subsidies and tax concessions on products which are beneficial to public will be under reallocation of resources. Then the other one is government expenditure, which is made on public goods. What are these public goods? Those goods which bring about a social welfare in an economy. So these kind of questions will be asked as to what value they depict. So they will all be under reallocation of resources because they fulfill the socio-economic objective. The second one is reduction in income inequalities. This is the second objective. So what type of components will be included over here? More tax on rich people and low tax on lower income groups. Now here questions like the richer people are taxed more than the lower income groups. So what value does it depict? So you will write under reduction in income inequalities. Then providing free services like education and health, providing essential items to people living under the below poverty line like food items and others. Then the third one is subsidy or free LPG to public. Questions like government has started spending more on providing free services like education and health to the poor. Explain the economic value it affects. So that will come under reduction in income inequalities, because these kind of activities, they give more purchasing power to the economically poor people and less in the hands of the richer people, so thereby bringing an inequality in the economy. Then the third objective is economic stability or price stability. Here it takes care of the price fluctuations, that means inflation and deflation. When there is more aggregate demand, that means when there is more income, there will be more aggregate demand, which will lead to inflation, that is rise in prices. So here what type of questions are asked? When there is reduction in government expenditure during inflation, what does it depict? It shows bringing about economic stability in the economy. Then the other one is tax concessions or subsidies to private sector to raise the aggregate supply. Increase in government expenditure or reduction in taxes during deflation or recession. The value that is depicted over here in these cases is bringing about an economic stability in the economy or price stability in the economy. Right? Then the fourth one is economic growth. What does this mean? This means an increase in the GDP or the volume of goods and services. Increase in the volume of goods and services. Now, what type of questions are asked over here? See, tax concessions or subsidies are given for the industries in backward regions to increase production. So, what value is it depicting? This shows an economic growth in the economy. Then the other one is the government expenditure on infrastructure. This also brings about a welfare and also increase in the volume of the goods and services. So, it will depict the economic growth value. Then the second part of the government budget is components of the government budget. We know the components of the government budget are revenue budget and the capital budget. Then again, the revenue budget consists of the revenue receipts and the revenue expenditure. So whatever the government receives revenue is spent on various activities for social welfare, that is called as the revenue expenditure. So whatever is revenue receipt, that itself is used for revenue expenditure. So that is why it is called as revenue expenditure from the revenue receipts. So the revenue receipts consists of the tax and the non-tax receipts. Then tax receipts can be direct or indirect. The direct ones are the income tax and the corporate tax. The income tax is paid by the households directly to the government, whereas corporate tax is paid by the firms. Then indirect taxes are the GST, what we are calling now. Then this GST, you is a has the other taxes have been subsumed into the GST. They are the central excise duty, service tax, octroi, sales tax, VAT, entry tax, entertainment tax, and so on and so forth. So earlier we had so many taxes. Now all of them have been subsumed into one tax called as the goods and services tax, right? Then the non-tax revenue or the non-tax receipts include interest on loans, dividends and profits, fees that is paid to the government, and the cash grants in aid. So all of them are included under the non-tax receipts. Now whatever expenditure is made from this receipts will be called as the revenue expenditure. Now since it's only a revenue, it neither creates a liability nor does it reduce the assets of the government. Now the other one is the capital budget, right? The capital budget consists of again capital receipts and capital expenditure. So these, they create a liability and they also reduce the assets of the government. Now the capital receipts consist of those which cause debt, like the borrowings, which could be public borrowings, borrowing from the public or from the RBI or from any foreign monetary organization like the IMF. And the non-debt creating, like the disinvestment, that means sale of the public sector units to the private sector, then recovery of loans, all these come under capital receipts because these bring in some revenue to the government, right? Now the capital expenditure, this is creation of assets like buildings and roads and dams and other things, then investment in shares, also loans to other state governments and the union and territories by the central government. All of these either create a liability or reduce the assets of the government. So they come under the capital budget. Now here in components of the government budget, we will be asked like under what will you include this? Like let us say income tax. Income tax is included under revenue receipts. Is it true or false? Yes, it is a true statement. Something from here can be given. Like disinvestment is a revenue expenditure. Is it true? No, it is the capital receipt, non-debt creating capital receipt. So this is what we need to remember. What all are the components under each heading? They will be asked as 1 markers. I skipped this revenue expenditure. This revenue expenditure is interest payments on loans, grants given to state governments and other parties. Then it could be defense services expenditure, salaries and pensions that are paid by the government, expenditure on free health and education, subsidies that are provided. So anything that is provided free by the government comes under the revenue expenditure. This is one of the questions from the CBSE 2019 paper. Classify as revenue receipts or capital receipts. Give reason for your answer. Right? The first one was financial help from a multinational corporation for a flood affected area. See, this is a financial help. So it's in a way transfer payment. So it is a revenue receipt. It's a revenue receipt of the government because it neither creates a liability nor reduces the assets. Then the second one is sale of public sector units to a private company, Y Limited. So what is it? Is it a revenue receipt or a capital receipt? It is a capital receipt of the government because it reduces the assets of the government. See, sale of PSUs, it's disinvestment, isn't it? So it is a capital receipt, right? So such type of questions are asked under this. Then the third part of it is measures of government deficit. Now we learned government budget includes receipts and expenditure. So when the receipts are equal to the expenditure, then we call it a balanced budget. But if the receipts are greater than the expenditure, then we have a surplus budget because receipts are greater. So it's called a surplus budget. However, if receipts are less than the expenditure, then it is called a deficit budget. Now here we are going to learn revenue deficit, fiscal deficit and the primary deficit. We are going to revise. So what is revenue deficit? When the revenue expenditure is greater than the revenue receipts. So that will give us the revenue deficit. Fiscal deficit is the difference between the total expenditure and total receipts less borrowings. Okay. So what is total expenditure? Total expenditure is revenue expenditure as well as the capital expenditure. So sum total of revenue as well as the capital expenditure gives us the total expenditure minus total receipts less borrowings. So this is revenue receipts plus non-debt creating capital receipts. Okay. So if you rearrange this, we will get revenue deficit plus capital expenditure minus non-debt creating capital receipts. So see, there is a relationship between fiscal deficit and the revenue deficit, isn't it? So major part of the fiscal deficit will be the revenue deficit. This is what we need to remember, because that is what is asked. What is the, how are they related, and what is the revenue deficit the major part of the fiscal deficit? Yes. Fiscal deficit would mean a large amount of borrowings. A large fiscal deficit means large amount of borrowings. So this creates a large burden on the interest payments and repayment of loans in the future. This fiscal deficit is also a key variable in judging an economy's health and stability of the economy. So this line comes in the question, is the fiscal deficit a variable in judging the economy's health? How? So, the governments are generally very worried when the fiscal deficit is more, because see, it is a burden of interest payments. So if one government leaves us with a burden of interest payments, it gets carried over year after year on the next government also. So that's why fiscal deficit is a concern. In 2000, in the last budget, we had 4.5% of the GDP as a fiscal deficit, but here in 2021, that the budget was read out, it was estimated to be 9.5% of the GDP, right? So yeah, the next one is the primary deficit, which is the difference between the fiscal deficit and the interest payments. So rearranging them, we get fiscal deficit is equal to primary deficit plus the interest payments. So what does this show? This shows that if the primary deficit is equal to 0, then the fiscal deficit is only equal to the interest payments. So what does this mean? This means that the government will have to borrow only on account of the interest payments. Now in CBSE 2019 paper, this question was asked. Suppose you are a member of the advisory committee to the Finance Minister of India. The Finance Minister is concerned about the rising revenue deficit in the budget. Suggest one measure to control the revenue deficit in the budget. Now, the measures to control this revenue deficit would be to reduce the government expenses, to reduce the burden of subsidy, and to increase the taxation. So that will help us combat this kind of a situation. Then the other question was that the revenue deficit increases when government fails to recover loans forwarded to different nations. This was the question, and you had to state whether it is true or false, giving a reason. This statement is false. Why? Because recovery of loans is a capital receipt, right? It is a capital receipt, so it does not affect the revenue receipts. So those were the questions. But here in 2021 board examinations, now numericals from deficit are deleted. So we need to learn only the theory part of the measures of government deficit.